We go. Hi, everyone. We are live with Writing History into Your Fiction. And we have some great panelists with us today. And I'm just going to let them introduce themselves because they can probably do a better job than I can. So we're going to start here with Olivia Atwater.
Hi, I'm Olivia Atwater. I'm a Regency fantasy and contemporary fantasy author. I'm based out of Montreal, Quebec. I have 2 cats and a wonderful husband who did this audio setup for me. So if anything goes wrong, you can blame him.
Convenient.
Okay, and now we have the lovely Margaret Pinard, which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience know already, but let's introduce her.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret Pinard. I'm historical fiction and fantasy author, and because Olivia did it, I'm based in Oregon and California and also Austin land. My historical fiction is Scotland, Canada, America, and short stories, and we're moving beyond that as well. So get ready for some fantasy.
Okay, and now we have Courtney Millicam. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yes, you did. I am Courtney Millicam. I am the author of a 1920s Peter Pan retelling called The Never Heir. That was my debut, and it is part of a 1920s fairy tale retelling trilogy. And I am based near Rocky Mountains.
Nice.
Okay, and now Christy Stratos.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Stratus. I write Victorian-era historical suspense and historical fantasy, otherwise known as gaslamp fantasy. I'm based in New Jersey, and I also co-host a once-a-month live read podcast called Lurking for Legends, and I'm also an editor. So that's all about me. That's really all you need to know.
And now we go for Leah Lindemann. And again, I hope
I'm Leah Lindemann. I'm the author of the Canadian Reminiscence series, and this series spans 13 provinces and territories of Canada. So there's still quite a few books to go, but I'm working on that. And I'm based in Eastern Ontario.
Okay, and that leaves me. And I'm your host, J.F. Stewart, Anita Stewart. I write a lot of stuff and a lot of eras, mostly Victorian Britain. I do a lot of alternate history as well. I've got a fairy tale retelling that's all set in all sorts of histories coming up in October, including ancient Rome, feudal Japan, and medieval Germany. So yeah, I'm all over the place as far as that. And I'm from Nova Scotia, Canada. So that's me.
Nice.
This
Okay,
is
so
unprecedented. There are 3 Canadians in this. I feel like it's an embarrassment of Canadians.
yeah, that's totally my fault. Total country nepotism there.
Oh yeah, I
Is that
approve.
your
I approve.
Collective noun. I wouldn't be surprised.
It's true.
Okay, so what drew you guys to writing historical fiction or historical fantasy?
Let's see. I used to do historical reenactment, and it was on the front end, it was very silly. It was all improv and like engaging people in silly games and stuff. But on the back end, everyone was very, very serious about the history. I was hanging out with master's degrees and PhDs, and if you've ever met those people, they are always thrilled to tell you their favorite little known facts about various historical eras. And I gobbled it up and made a lot of historian friends. And so when I came up with the concept for the Regency fairy tales, I realized that there was a lot of crossover between classical fairy tales and what the Regency genre has become. And so I kind of played with the crossover there, and I hit up some of my old historical friends, and I said, I know someone who's an expert in the Regency era. And predictably, I had like 2 or 3 people instantly go, oh, I've done the Regency era. And one of my friends who did their thesis on it helped me craft the books. And so that's how I ended up kind of dabbling in historical fantasy. funny enough, the Regency era is not my, like, I didn't reenact the Regency era. I reenacted the Tudor era. So I know a whole lot about the Tudor era. But since writing these books and hanging out with my historical friend a whole lot, I guess now I've become a lot more familiar with the Regency era. It happened slowly while I wasn't paying attention.
Okay. Anybody else want to tell us how they got into writing historical fiction or fantasy?
I think it was pretty similar. Like a reenactment is a form of theater. And so I actually just did a bunch of book tags on my channel, and I talked about what got me into my favorite genre. And historical fiction to me feels like theater. And, you know, if you go to one of Christie's Lurking for Legends, they often have readings and people get very into the theatrical aspect. So I think like that's a common feeling maybe, but stepping into a world that's, you know, not your own, where anything can happen and you have to be a believer and not be a cynic. And like, I love that aspect of it. So it's what I read. So that was what I first went to when I started to write as an adult.
Okay.
Yeah,
Anyone else?
I would love to jump in here. I think that historical fiction and fantasy maybe have a little bit more in common than what people think. It's kind of like what Margaret said, you're kind of peeking, you know, into another world as we look into the past and things that we can learn from there. And same thing with fantasy, you're peeking into a different world, different way of life. And I think the idea of like combining those two things is so fascinating for me because yeah, anything can happen, and you can take little known facts and facets from history and combine them with historical details and create something brand new.
Okay. What about you, Christy?
Yeah, I actually remember saying years and years ago, I will never ever write historical fiction because it's too hard. And then this is where I ended up writing all historical fiction. And
Oh my gosh, amen.
right?
I said that a long time ago, yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was too hard. But then, you know, I started really digging into the research. I realized that a lot of the TV I was watching was period dramas anyway. And it was heavily the Victorian era. And I was really enjoying doing research on just everything from the Victorian era, from the handwriting to the clothing and the dresses. And, you know, I ended up doing like a paper having very heavily to do with the Victorian era in college. And, you know, it ended up being the era that I really connected with for whatever reason. So I started writing in it, and it was just a story that sort of came to me in the Victorian era for whatever reason. It was Anatomy of a Darkened Heart. And it just continued that way because once I started doing the research and integrating fiction and history together, I started realizing how much I love it. It's just, there's something about being able to take real life and use it to create something very real and yet fictional that is exciting to me. So that's kind of how I ended up continuing on it. Okay,
so what about you, Leah? How did you get into it?
I've always loved history. I wish I could be a time traveler, literally, but I can't. So this is the way I time travel, right? Just get lost in a different era. The Victorian era is also my favorite as well. I do enjoy the Regency. I love everything, but yeah, history just calls to my heart. So I was reading it a lot when I was younger. And then when I got into writing and I had the idea for my book, my first book, it was that, but it was actually rooted in Canadian history, which I don't know much about. I know a lot of American history. I know old world, ancient history, but not Canadian history. So it's kind of my way of discovering Canada's history while writing it, while falling in love with it. And then hopefully the readers can do that too.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Leah. I've always been a history buff, love history, love every sort of era that there is, and I have researched it. So it was kind of inevitable that it would get into my writing eventually. So, okay, so what's your favorite thing about writing historical fiction?
Wow. I think my favorite thing about historical fiction is getting to immerse people in a historical era in a way that academically most people don't get. I find that at the high school level or a little bit above, even sometimes at the bachelor's level, we ingest history very differently than people who study it at a master's or a PhD level. which is we memorize facts. We get things very flattened. We hear facts about the era as though everybody in the era was kind of uniform. And that really does a disservice to history, I find. But once you engage with history on a first person level, or you start reading like documents in people's own words, that's where your higher level historians are. And that's why they're so much more excited about history, I think, than people at the lower levels of it, because it just gives you more room to humanize it, and to understand people during that era. And the more that I have engaged with it at that level, the more that I found that people historically have not been different from us in the modern era. They have all of the same impulses, and we so easily flatten those out. Like I said, like for instance, I think for some reason in the modern era we like looking back and being like, "Oh, thank goodness we're so much better than those British historical people," and yet I can find parallels of things that have cycled and repeated and repeated and repeated throughout history, and we just call them different things. And at the same time, there have always been people who knew better too, which is very hopeful. I like that. Being able to look back and say, well, actually, no. Yeah, we like to say, oh, well, it was just a different time then. But someone during that era, every time, knew that certain things were wrong and was speaking out about it. And so, what I have really dug into with historical fiction, historical fantasy, is pulling out those parallels and showing people that every problem we think is a purely modern problem we have had before. And we have had solutions to those problems before. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. And I think showing that to people that we've been here before, we overcame it before, here's how we did it. I don't know, it just feels very empowering to me.
Okay, so Margaret, what's your favorite thing about writing history?
Oh, well, I'm going to make this like a middle of the road question between this one and the last one, because like what got me in and what was part of my favorite thing is that when you set something in a different time and place, people don't automatically think it reflects on them. So even if you're highlighting injustice and cowardice and arrogance and greed that still exists today, people don't automatically assign people they know to these roles and either disagree or agree with you. They are lured in on false pretenses to get into the story and be emotional and follow someone's reasoning, and be compassionate. And so what I like about it is that you're sort of able to present a story that is universal, but trick people into like considering it when maybe they wouldn't have if you gave them different names. So,
Margaret, I just want you to know I fell in love with you a little bit right there. I have a whole talk. I literally just did a whole podcast on why historical fantasy is specifically great for satire. And it's everything you just said.
Okay. There we go. All right. Well, we'll need to know where to find that podcast after the show.
Okay, so Leah, what's your favorite thing about writing history?
I love that it's timeless, and it kind of goes along with what Margaret and Olivia said. There's nothing new under the sun. People are the same. And for those who usually wouldn't want to get into history because they think it's dry and it's just not something that they would enjoy, I love using the entertainment side of it to show them that, you know, it's important to know history so history doesn't repeat itself. We can learn from our history, and not even just movements. It could be big picture, but people, they connect with the smaller character pictures of those emotions that you pull out through the story and the decisions that your characters make. And you can impact someone's life just by bringing them along on that journey, that personal journey, and to show them that we can learn from the past mistakes or whatever the past got right, and then build a brighter tomorrow with that.
Excellent. So, Christy, what's your favorite thing?
I picking up from what Olivia said about how history, the way it's taught, especially when you're young and it's like up through high school and even in, you know, uh, college when you're not getting your master's or PhD or anything, it's very flat. It's very boring. It's all memorization, just like she said. And I kind of found myself stunned once I started doing my own research when I was a little bit older. And, I was like reading these Victorian newspapers and was like, this is fascinating. Why don't we learn any of this stuff? This is really amazing. And so much was really left out, honestly. We learned like a lot of high level, big picture stuff that other people dealt with too, but we're only taught about one group. For example, there's just so much missing. Even when you look at books having to do with historical fashion, it depends on the book you pick up. If you don't look at things from that time period, if you see modern books, so many times you're seeing, like, I think Olivia mentioned something about this too, just the same thing over and over that doesn't really give the depth of the time period. I have so many Victorian pictures, for example, daguerreotypes, and the hairstyles, the fashion, it really doesn't always match what's in these historical fashion books. It can be very different, especially the hairstyles. It was really whatever worked for your hair. This is what I'm finding. This is what I'm discovering about women's hairstyles. It was a tough time. They didn't have a whole lot to work with, so all those details really, it excites me to put them into these books and make like history so much more interesting and give it so much more depth. And these are just details. I mean, never mind all of the infamous, historical figures that nobody seems to know anymore because we don't learn about them. They may not be important to like classroom learning type of stuff, but they are actually really fascinating and might have taught us more than some of the figures that we actually have learned in school. So I love every aspect of that depth.
Yeah, I probably know quite a few of those infamous historical figures.
Yeah.
But okay, Courtney, what's your favorite thing about writing history?
Man, I agree with everything that you guys have said. I just feel like being able to immerse other people in a historical time period. I especially love dialing down on those little known day-to-day aspects and facts of life from people throughout history, kind of like what was mentioned before, moving away from like the big picture of what was going on during that time period and really dialing it down into an individual's life and their experience and maybe how it was different from our preconceived notions about what we thought we knew about that time period.
Yeah, I agree with Courtney. That's kind of my favorite thing too, is to recreate the world and find those pieces that are wrong, the kind of like got the wrong look on it today. Like we think we know history was this way, but it actually wasn't. It was this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to recreate the worlds and show that too in my books. So oh yeah, and Shannon has a interesting little tidbit here. Having done some Irish research, try writing about third century Ireland during a time when they didn't write anything down. All her research had to go off documents written hundreds of years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been there and
Oh my
done that.
God. Bog bodies. How do bog bodies keep coming up around me? I know like 3 different people who are obsessed with bog bodies. It's so funny. Okay. Shannon, Esty, Shannon. Okay. You and Jacqueline Benson just need to have like a sit down so you can just have fun talking about bog bodies together. She loves them.
P.S. This Saturday, July 22nd, is International Bog Day. For anyone who's
Oh
interested
my
in
gosh.
wonderful ecosystem.
That is perfect.
Yes, well, bog bodies are probably right up my alley too, because yeah, pretty sure some of my stories have people throwing bodies in. Well, I know in my historical fantasy that I'm currently writing, the bodies get thrown in the canals of Venice.
Oh.
Not quite a bog, but we have carnivorous mermaids in the canals, so yeah.
Ooh.
Oh.
So the bodies do disappear. So anyway, so let's discuss research now. Of course, you can't have historical fiction or fantasy without the research. How far do you fall down the rabbit hole when you're doing your research?
I think we all, I just saw everybody's face just change at that. Yeah, I have spent entire days researching one tiny historical fact that I eventually end up realizing I'm just not going to use.
That's
Like,
it.
I'm in editing and I'm like, oh, wait, no, I need to figure out whether this is actually accurate. This, what would a maid wear under this circumstance at this social class and this time period? And then I eventually realized, well, I just cut that line anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent 2 hours researching the difference between doorknobs and door handles in the Victorian era for one sentence
Ooh.
in a story.
Oh, see, now I'm intrigued.
I was about to say, I may need to know what you found out for reasons.
Basically, they were interchangeable during that particular time period. So, yeah, the research was interesting, but I could have done it either way and it wouldn't have mattered. So, anyway, so what about you, Margaret? How far do you fall down the rabbit hole?
It depends on how limitless I'm feeling. Like if it's to deadline, I don't really do deadlines with my writing. So, if I'm feeling like expansive and that I'm still in the unearthing phase, then it could take days where I'm cogitating on something. If I'm feeling exasperated and like I just want to write this damn thing and get to the end of the damn chapter, and then it could be like XX, go to later, It's sort of like a new thing. Yeah.
No, so Neil Gaiman actually has a great quote on that, and I can't quote it verbatim, but he said something along the lines of a first draft is successful if it's finished, and the second draft is for making it look like you knew what you were doing all along.
There you go.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the rest of you? How far do you guys fall down the rabbit hole?
I'm a lot like Margaret, where if I know myself and I know that if I start researching some tiny little fact, it's going to take me all day and I probably could have spent that time writing. So I will use placeholders in my drafts, and I'll say, I'll write, she wore a dress, and then I'll highlight the word dress and then go research exactly what they were wearing later. In my book, I have a character who works at a grocery store in 1920s London. And I spent, I don't even know how many hours finding exactly the items that he would be stocking on the shelf that I'm sure my reader does not even care about. I could have just said he was stocking items, but no, I had to know that he was stocking self-rising cake flour that was like a brand new thing that had just come out during that time. And it's exciting for me to find those little tidbits and add them in. But I think as writers, we need to be careful. One, not to go so far down the rabbit hole that we're neglecting our writing. And two, that these are actually things that, add to the realness of the story, and not just things that we're throwing in there kind of willy-nilly because we like them. We all have our favorite facts, I think.
And that can be dangerous too, because if you have like a standalone fact that you're excited to share and you put that in the novel as a one line that you think, oh, people will be excited about this, but you don't have a background in it, you could be missing that depth of understanding. Would that really apply in that circumstance, or is it sort of doesn't fit for someone who knows the situation more thoroughly? And so, like, talk about a rabbit hole. I took a whole herbology course over a summer to be able to have more of a grounding in what herbs would people use and what was available in different regions and how would they make tinctures and what's available in Scotland versus Canada and all that kind of stuff. So
I just want to add, I have done so much research on actual historical magic, like ceremonial magic, and so much of it I cannot use, just because it's so gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Grim. So I'm working on a Victorian fantasy right now, and there is an entire section of English magic known as negromancy, and there are first off, I cannot use that name, and two, it involves things like digging up dead body parts and
yeah.
So it's talk about research that I cannot use.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Christy and I are probably going, can we use it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Historical horror.
Really
Alert,
dark.
alert.
Yeah, because I mean, I wrote a short story which Christy read on her show, and did a wonderful job as the lead character. By the way, you
Yeah.
nailed it. Anyway, but she actually has two people going around digging up bodies for parts. So
It's a good short story.
I can get away with more of it in my current Victorian fantasy because it is more on the Gothic side. But there are still limits. My readers are still very
Yeah.
like they prefer things that are uplifting and at least a little whimsical, and so I'm on the side of like dark whimsy now. Like, I'm pushing the envelope, but there's still things I can't do.
Makes sense.
okay, Sylvia, how far you fall down the rabbit hole?
I give myself a good chunk of time before I start the writing to just kind of wade into the waters and let myself go wherever the tide pulls me. Because each of my books are set in a different province, in a different historical period, and a different setting. So I'll just really dive into the setting and the whole circumstances around the setting and what kind of made it to be what it was. So at times I'll go into very specific details, but I'll do that all before the writing. And then when I'm actually writing, I'll do what Margaret does. I'll star, like I'll put little stars if I missed a detail, and then I'll come back to it later. But yeah, I kind of like to have time that's not touched just to bathe in the research. But then I put a pretty hard stop on it to get into the writing. It just helps me, organize my time that way.
Yeah.
Okay, what about you, Christy?
I often convince myself in the moment that I absolutely need to research this, even if it doesn't make sense afterwards. Afterwards, I say, why? What were you thinking? And I don't know what I was thinking. I can't remember. It's like I just forget what my train of thought even was that led me there. But I will go all the way to like whether they had mortar in the roof of Fort Ticonderoga. I mean, that is what happened to me not that long ago. Why? It was like all I was trying to do was have a setting with like a 1700s fort. Somehow this led me to thinking I needed to know what material they used for the roof. And I got into this whole enormous research rabbit hole, and it was very, very interesting because it had to do with how they just didn't have the people here, in America yet to be digging into limestone, which is what they hit. And so they had to wait and they had to use something else. How does this help me? It didn't help me at all. This doesn't help me with what it looked like. What am I doing?
Where's the line between like using magic for something and needing a historical reason? Why can't you poof?
Right, yeah. So this is like, and it's funny you say that because it was for a magical realm. So like, what am I doing?
Oh, wow.
Stop it. Just stop it.
You know what? I will say one of the things that I like to do is that I'll have a sit down with my historical expert, because I always have a nitpick or a historical expert that I have go over my stuff afterwards. But I like involving them early as well, because I'll sit down with my outline and I'll be like, hey, what's a cool thing from this era that comes to your mind that I could work into this outline? And he's amazing. He is encyclopedic. I know not everyone is, but like there's such a difference between someone who knows how to research the era and someone who has already researched the era and just knows things. Yeah. And it's great because I'll have him at all stages of the process, and he's always so excited to add things to it. And I think my favorite thing he's done for me is that for my current Victorian fantasy, I asked, so, hey, can you tell me about what the architecture of this country manor would look like during this era? And he went, actually, this is my obsession, and I actually build historically accurate Sims houses. Here, I'll give you a list of, tell me exactly what year you're looking at that this was built in, and then here are the 2 or 3 different types of architecture it could be. You pick one, and I will build you a Sims house that is actually the house that you are writing in.
That might actually get me to watch a YouTube channel about The Sims.
I
That
would
And
watch
I
that.
like that
I
is
would
just
watch it.
so amazing, and this is why I love him. Like if it's Regency or Victorian, I will never use anyone else just because this guy is just so he's my favorite level of obsessed about everything.
nice.
Oh.
Okay, so when you're creating or rebuilding your historical setting, have you encountered any obstacles, and how did you overcome them?
I think my main obstacle, in addition to the ones I've mentioned, which is there are some historical facts I just cannot put into my books. I think one of my obstacles is trying to convey to readers historical facts that are accurate, that they instinctively don't believe are accurate because they have a very distorted idea of what the period was like, especially in the Regency era. There's like the Regency genre is very fairy tale-ish. It has been distorted into this bizarre idea of what the Regency era was like, and as soon as you start introducing real social history into it, the readers get a little tetchy. So, gosh, I think the main thing which surprised me was I have workhouses in my first Regency fantasy book, and you would not believe the number of people who seem to think that workhouses were invented in the Victorian era, and they're very upset about it. They're like, well, workhouses didn't exist until the Victorian era, and I'm going, what? Where? And you're very sure about this. I don't know why.
Guess who was just studying up on the poor laws of 1832 and 1834?
Right? Like,
The difference between UK and Ireland's application. Oh gosh.
I mean, the act which made the workhouses worse happened in the Victorian era, but it had to make them worse because they already existed and were already very bad. Like, so yeah, that's been a weird one that I've had to deal with, and I think that's been my main issue.
You know what that reminds me of? Someone is a Lord of the Rings fan and may have listened to all of the production design team's backstage commentary during the movies, and they were aggrieved, I tell you, aggrieved that they had to put in a metal like sound when they withdrew a sword from a scabbard because people expected it, and they would have rioted if they didn't have that sound effect, even though it was historically inaccurate. And the design team was just like, sometimes you just lose. Oh my God, I feel your pain.
No. Yeah, I feel that. I feel that in my bones.
Good times.
Okay, so we have a question. Emily wants to know if you take your time doing the research, not to overwhelm yourself with information, or if you put aside time to do the research so you don't get discouraged or overwhelmed.
I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
I personally think it's different for everybody. For me, I tend to get a little bit stressed sometimes and have a hard time moving along if I don't do the research in that moment, only because I have not done the research in the moment and then it has messed up what I wrote later. So like, of course it depends. If it's a detail, like Courtney was saying, like a detail, like what a dress looks like, it might not be that big of a deal. But if it's the difference between candlelight and a gas lamp, or something like that, it can be a pretty big difference. So I think it does take just some experimentation to see how you feel and whether it affects the rest of the story.
Yeah, I do a lot of research beforehand before I start writing, but like sometimes you hit a detail in the book that you have to research, like the Renaissance Italian fantasy I'm writing. I had a guy going through a cabinet, and I'm going, wait a minute, does this cabinet have drawers? Because I can't have him going through drawers in a cabinet if Italian Renaissance cabinets didn't have drawers.
Yeah.
So I had to stop and research that to find out. So yeah, sometimes you hit things while you're writing that you just have to research, and sometimes you can just like put the placeholders in. But
Yeah, I had that with my second book. So kind of going even with the last question I've had with my first book, it's in a city. So I looked up, the old maps from that time, and it was pretty easy to work within the confines of what you had because that's there. So you work your story within. But with the second book, it's just so broad because it's the West and it was very open land. I hit across, she finds gold at a mountain. And I was like, great, which mountain is it? Because there's a lot of mountains in the Rockies in BC. And it kind of needs to work with where I've set up my story, and it needs to work with travel time. And so I had written the book and I was like, oh no, I really need it to be a specific mountain. So that's where I really had to make a full stop and just kind of look at the topography and the geography. And I actually did settle on a mountain, and it was called Eureka Mountain. So it kind of made sense with what I was writing. But yeah, sometimes to not be overwhelmed by the lack of detail, you need to take that break and research.
I like
Okay.
doing things. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, does anybody else have any obstacles that they've had to overcome in their settings?
I like doing things in bouts like that, but that approach led me down in a dead alley, a dark alley, a dead end. That's what I meant. And I had a plot written out that included someone getting a message in time to sail across the Atlantic and see her mother before she died. There were no telegraphs. And I had about 30 years between when there would be telegraphs in this remote part of Scotland. And I was like, okay, I could fudge 5 years because people aren't going to like look that up and be sticklers. But 30 years, that's going to be like an era of inaccuracy I cannot live with myself. So she didn't get to see her mom before she died. And it just changed her like grief after that. And I was like, okay, we're rewriting it. But it took a long time to sort of go, I can't figure out any way and I can't leave it. And I have to change the story. So I had to like leave it and come back. But yeah.
That reminds me, actually, the 30 years thing. I, for some reason, people really, really get Edwardian and Regency fantasy mixed up, and I don't know why.
Yes!
I can't tell you the number of people who have been like, oh yes, the Regency fairy tales are Edwardian fantasy, and I went, but it's in the name.
Right.
That's 100-year difference. Like, a lot. I do understand people who are like, oh, it's Victorian. And I'm like, okay, well, you could stretch it and say it's Victorian-ish, maybe, but Edwardian?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with this book, it's set in the Georgian and into the Regency era. And I had a reviewer call it the Victorian era. And I've got the dates in the book of when the times, because it's written like diary, so I've got like the dates and the years in the book. So, but the reviewer called it Victorian. So yeah, things like that happen all the time.
I'm really wondering who's gonna get it wrong with the Victorian fairy tales. Like I've been putting it in the series titles, and I'm just wondering, like, am I gonna have people being like, this is a great Regency fantasy?
Okay, so has anybody else come up against obstacles when doing historical settings?
Yeah, my Gaslamp fantasy takes place in Boston in 1850, and so it was my first time. Actually, it wasn't my first time, but it was my first time setting something in a city, like a specific city, not like it's somewhere in Massachusetts with Massachusetts for inspiration type of thing. So it's exactly Boston in 1850. I'm trying not to, fictionalize too much there. And it is sometimes way harder. This is one of the reasons my first two books that are historical suspense are like no name town, so that I don't have to deal with that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I just made my own place. I didn't even name it. I just didn't name it. But, this time I really wanted to, and I felt really drawn to Boston. So sometimes it's really, really tricky to find the types of, like, I'm looking for literally shops that are within walking distance from where these characters live, and creating locations, that actually existed, but I'm using them for a different purpose or something like that. Some things need to be walkable, and it can get pretty tricky. So I did end up buying this Boston Almanac, which is from 1849.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's very neat.
Yeah, which is really, really cool. And it enabled me to actually look up a lot of business owners and different names of businesses. And, you know, finding the maps can be pretty tricky. This one has a map, but it's from pretty big distance. So sometimes I do have to contact like the Massachusetts Historical Society and ask them questions, you know, just having to do with were there residences on this road I can't find anywhere, if it's residences or businesses type of thing, you know, like those little details that I know most readers aren't going to care about, but to me it matters. And that's just me. So like, you know, I'm well aware that readers aren't going to be like, you know, was there a business there? I'm really mad about this. But those, you know, can be obstacles where, you know, I start out at one location. I want them to walk to, I had this one thing where they needed to walk to Atwood and Bacon, which is a really famous oyster restaurant. And I needed to see like where could they walk there? Was it a distance they could make it? Which house would they need to start from if they were going to make it? How long would it take? Does this give these people enough time to do that thing over there? You know, so like those are the obstacles that I've found kind of the most difficult to resolve sometimes.
I guarantee you some reader does care.
Somewhere, someone's going to be like, "Nope."
They will know.
Yes. Well, and I feel like too, like when you include those like historical little tidbits, like it just makes that world that much more like vibrant and alive. And and I totally agree with you, because I had the same problem when I was writing my 1920s historical fantasy that takes place in London. For that same reason, I had to know, yeah, what was in walking distance? Could they realistically take a cab here and get to this place by this time? And it's just like, oh, I just need like a time machine to go back and walk it myself so I can know.
Yeah. Sure.
And when I was recreating 15th century Venice, I thought it would be easy because, you know, everybody knows Venice, right? And then I come to researching that particular time period I was using and to realize that most of the landmarks in Venice didn't exist in that time period.
Oh.
So it's like, yeah, I have to recreate the city without the Bridge of Sighs and without and St. Mark's Chapel wasn't St. Mark's Chapel, it was the Doge's Chapel, and the seat of the religion was way off on this island halfway across the city. So yeah, so that was fun. So have you added any historic figures into your books, and how did you go about doing that?
I, as a rule, never use real historical figures on screen. I have sometimes made allusions to them. I've had them maybe do things off screen that impact what's happening on screen. But I don't know. It's weird. For all that I don't have any problem dabbling in history and changing some things for historical fiction. I just feel awkward trying to write real historical figures. It feels I think some part of my brain is constantly like, what if somebody like 100 years in the future tried to write me? That would be really weird. And so I find that I just have a weird mental taboo against it, and I just can't bring myself to do it.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I'm the same. I don't write real historical figures into my writing. I've had my characters talk about either like some prominent people or like a prominent headline that was happening at that time, like as part of their conversation. But yeah, they don't actually make appearances in my story.
I do have, I didn't used to have any historical figures, but now I occasionally will have, but I only do it when there isn't as much. I typically only do it because who knows what's to come. And someone will watch this interview in 5 years and say, you said. Like, but yeah, I try to only use them mostly when there's less known about them. So I have this one character, Dr. C.L. Blood, and there is not that much history on him. He was a scam artist. He was a, fake. He wasn't a real doctor, but he pretended to be a doctor. He came up with this cure for all this stuff that he knew was not a cure for anything, all that kind of stuff. So we know that much, but there's a lot that is not known about his life. And I was able to gather from articles about him at the time a good amount of his personality and things like that. So I sort of put those together and was able to write him the way he probably was, but there's so little information that it's not like I'm writing somebody where you can, somebody's going to be really into that historical figure and say, oh, I have all this research that I've done, and actually they were much more like this. The person, I want to get the personality as close as I can to what they actually were. So through what I can find on him through articles and things like that, I can put together a pretty good picture of what he was like. But otherwise, I try not to include like big people because I think it's real easy to kind of make a mess of it. Not like a badly intentioned mess, a well-intentioned mess where somebody else knows a lot better.
Well, I've done what you've done, Christy, in my first book. It was the captain of a ship. And so I had the name and I had some information, but again, he's not very well known. He's the captain of a ship. So I dug around a little bit. He was only in one scene. So I felt like I could stretch it. I could, use him just to kind of like as a means to an end to kind of get the story flowing. So I did that. But with the second book, which is the historical murder mystery, there's this judge in the West. He was called the Hangman Judge, but his name was Judge Begbie. And I just came across a story of him where he was at this hotel. He was on the second floor. His room had a balcony, and he actually overheard two men planning his demise, like wanting to kill him somehow. And he's just standing there listening. And then he goes and grabs his chamber pot and literally dumps all the contents over them. And it's just it's this really well-known story. And I was like, this is so funny. I just wanted to like add this little humorous tale that's true. I wasn't changing his character or personality in the least. I was just telling it kind of as I received it. But from my main character's point of view, she's kind of out in the streets late at night. She's being secretive. And then she's watching this whole scene happen. So I was like, I don't know. I had to tell this story from the viewpoint of the main character. She has to show the readers what I found out. And it was just a lot of fun to do that. But
how can you read that?
Other than that, he doesn't really make an appearance.
I love stuff like that where you're like, is it apocryphal? Maybe. Is it too good to pass up? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so Margaret and Courtney, have you added any historical figures to your books?
I think Courtney answered, right?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
I think for my historical mystery, I did mainly archetypes, like, 1880s rich business magnate, and sort of started from there. For the historical fiction trilogy, it was more ordinary people, every day, getting to know their experience because they're forgotten of history. And then for the supernatural one, it was more like, what conflicts can I imagine happened? And they're not based on anything except that these three groups were here at this time period. But for the last one in the trilogy, it was right around what's the word? It's not restitution, but when they gave money to the slave owners in recompense for having to free their slaves in Britain. And this just event and like learning about that was so galvanizing for me. I needed to include someone who had to do with that movement and had an opinion on it, rather than my people who weren't connected to it and probably only very tangential. So I did have William Wilberforce sort of worked in. He was talked about. There was some like possible way he was giving money to somebody who was involved in my characters' lives, and so it affected the plot and is completely made up. But I got to talk about him a little bit, and I don't think many Americans know about him. They should. So I felt like I would drop a name in there for someone to benefit from.
Okay, so I have actually added a historical figure in one of my works in progress, but it's alternate history. So I can play around with it a little more than if it was accurate, because I can say, well, yes, maybe it's not accurate to real history, but it's accurate to this alternate version of history.
That's fun.
So so Samuel Kennard is actually a secondary character in the book, and he's the royal engineer of Nova Scotia. and in charge of all the airships because it's a steampunk alternate history.
Uh,
And so, and the main character in the book is his vampire bodyguard. So
that's so
Wow.
cool.
Nice.
That's that's a really great advantage of historical fantasy as opposed to historical fiction. Is every once in a while you could be like, well, maybe that detail is technically wrong, but in this fantasy version,
Right. It's
Yeah.
intentional. It's intentional.
Yeah.
yeah, the alternate history is great for that because you can do things, that never actually happened, but it's alternate history.
look, a fairy did it. Okay,
Yeah,
that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's fun.
Occasionally you can do that in fantasies like historical fantasy too, because I mean I've blamed something on the dragons in one of my other books. So when you're writing female characters, how do you create historical accuracy but not play into inaccurate perceptions at the same time?
Wow, that's such a loaded question in some respects. I mean, first off, I would say that most people's idea of what difficulties women had in certain periods is largely inaccurate unless you're talking about the upper classes. Like a lot of the preconceptions about oh, women must get married and they must have a husband and they'll lose a bunch of rights and so on. Like I would say a lot of that is accurate to the upper classes, but the lower classes, women worked, and in a lot of periods women owned businesses even when technically the law said that they couldn't. Like in practice they did. And actually the Tudor era is if I recall, a really great example of this is it was not long after the War of the Roses, and so there was a huge shortage of men, and women were taking over the businesses of their husbands, their brothers, their children who had to go off to war, and so there were, it didn't really matter what on paper their rights were. In practice, you had lots of female business owners. And so that's just like just an example of how preconceptions can kind of get in the way sometimes. And again, I find that I'm of two minds on what I guess you could say is the overabundance of blue stockings in Regency fiction. Everybody's a blue stocking. So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, no, not every woman is going to be a blue stocking, but by definition, most of these books are following heroines that the author has decided the reader can specifically relate to, and so it's not outside the realm of possibility. And obviously, if you want your readers to like your heroine, there's no problem with saying, well, my heroine is a blue stocking. And again, like, it's a real movement. It did happen. There were real ones. So yeah, I end up of two minds on it because on the one hand, we we know that they did exist, and there's and that by definition our fictional choices are going to skew towards people who were part of that movement, in the same way that you're never probably as an author going to have a slave owner protagonist, because no one wants to read about a slave owner protagonist, even if they were, reasonably common at the time. Of course, the reader is going to want to follow an abolitionist or something of the sort, and they did exist. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on that. It's I straddle the line there.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else have thoughts on female characters in historical fiction? Margaret? I know you have thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, so like getting back to the first question of like people are the same everywhere. You have the range of personalities, you have the range of political viewpoints, and women are going to be the same in history as they are now. And so I feel like as authors, we get to choose. Are we going to write a character we sympathize with? Or are we going to go for an unlikable narrator and, like, I don't know, put ourselves through that? So the choices we make say a lot about what we want to highlight. And so for me, I usually go with characters that I can admire. I mean, I don't read the books where the character is unlikable a lot, unless someone's very clever and they lure me in, because, you know, that works with me too. But I want to see people who are doing the right thing, you know, people who identify with interests, even though they're in a different time period. So in terms of getting it right while also making it a good story, I try to stay within the common lines of, like, everyday people experience all these emotions, and I can assign different priorities to different characters. So, like, I am not going to be a person who knows grief very well, but I can assign that to this character and explore that with them. I am not obsessed with marriage, like, but I can assign that to this character and have that be their main conflict. Or, you know, losing the land. I don't own property, but when that is survival, like, I try to identify my deepest fears with their deepest insecurities. And to me, that universality is enough to carry a female character into believability and, you know, a good story. So yeah.
Okay, so does anyone else have any thoughts on balancing expectations with accuracy in female characters?
I think female characters, people get this idea that because it's history, they're one toned or they're always trapped within certain confines. And that may be true society wise, but as what someone already said, you know, women are the same today as they were back then. And there were ways to work around their situations to manifest how they really felt or the direction that they wanted to go in. And it's fun to kind of play, and then kind of going into character likability. Olivia, you mentioned, you know, whether you'd want to write about an abolitionist or a slaveholder. You could go either way, because either way, these people had fears and they had growth and they needed to work through things in their own spheres of influence. So it's interesting how you can pick those likable qualities or those unlikable qualities and still make the character resonate, even though they held a certain stance in history. So it's just fun to kind of play with that, because there's always going to be the character arc and the growth arc in that character. So yeah,
I think in general that might be the case. I think everyone should probably be aware at this point in the modern era that writing a slave owner protagonist is a great way to make a lot of people very angry. I don't care if they have growth. It's just not something we do.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else have thoughts?
I don't know. I would say that I take female characters, and I do this with all characters. I take female characters and I kind of, you know, whoever they are, and apply the time period to them. You know, they are who they are. They could be in any time period through history, as we've been talking about. We've had the same problems, the same emotions, etc., throughout history. So, you know, I would say that I don't like try to fit them into the time period, like squeeze them in one way or another, or, you know, how am I going to make this work? I really just apply the time period to them. So it's, you know, kind of like maybe they have to hide certain things about themselves, but that doesn't mean they're not that certain thing, you know, or maybe they can't say it out loud to certain people, but they have to find trusted people to say this thing to, you know. But, you know, I guess that's really kind of more how I think of it along those lines.
Yeah, a lot of my characters are dark, writing a lot of horror and history. So I sort of come at it from the worst side of history in a lot of cases, especially with some of my female characters, and especially with this upcoming book. A lot of them are not nice people.
Oh yeah, that's completely different in horror. You've got a completely different goal there as a writer.
So the expectations are kind of different, I think, a little bit coming from the historical horror side because, yeah, people want your characters to be awful in a lot of ways. Anyway, and also I found, like when I was reading the Renaissance Venice book, I had one character who was a nun, but the nuns in Venice had a lot of political power. So she gets to do a lot of things that you would not expect a nun to do.
I'm just taking notes over here. Like, this is
Yeah.
fascinating.
And I actually will probably have to tone a lot of that down because the nuns were very not nun-like, especially when it comes to sex. Let us say they did not practice chastity.
You know,
Well,
I have a question. Do they ever really? Like, I just have to say, every era of history I have gone into to look at religious figures, we always think of them as these very puritanical figures, and the reality is never that way. So I'm looking for the like, where is the thing that created this rule? Because all I'm finding are exceptions.
I mean, the rule was there. They just ignored it entirely.
That's exactly what I mean. I'm like,
yeah,
I mean, Chaucer, right? Like the Canterbury Tales. No, they're all having sex.
When I was researching the Italian nunneries, it's like they pretty much had a revolving door for their boyfriends. It's like, sneak them in at night, sneak them out in the morning. Yeah, it's like it was crazy. And women were actually trying to get into the nunneries as opposed to like being married off. It was an excellent alternative, especially in Venice. So it was a bit of an eye-opener with that research. It really was.
Wow.
I think with any religious political system, you're going to have people who actually did believe in it, who, stuck to the principles, but then you're going to have that whole other crop of group that just were rebellious and did whatever they wanted and found ways to get away with what they wanted, right? So it really doesn't, it's a little striking that it totally kills the stereotype, but I'm sure, that was the case. There were people, but when you have power, that, power can corrupt people and others will do well with it. So it really just depends.
Okay, so we've hit the hour here, so I think we'll wrap it up and I'll let everybody tell the audience where they can find you and your books. And we'll start with Leah.
You can find me on pretty much all social media, but I'm very active on, except for the last month. I've been very active on my YouTube channel, but I'm actually just nesting and dialing down because I'm about to give birth in a week. So that's why I have not been active. But my YouTube channel is Pen to Paper. My website is leahlindeman.com. You can find my books, paperback and ebook, on Amazon and basically all the big ebook platforms. And I'm also pretty active on Instagram. So there you'll find me.
Okay, where can we find you, Christy?
You can find me at my website, christystratus.com, where I sell signed paperbacks. And I do blog posts about the time period and things that are going on with me. You can sign up for my newsletter there. I'm also active on Facebook. I do less on my author page because, Facebook is just so random with what they promote. But I do have that, facebook.com/ChristyStratusAuthor. I also have a Facebook group that I'm much more active in, much more active, post a lot of very interesting things about the Victorian era. It's Christy Stratus's Victorian Darklings, I believe. And I'm in it every day, but I don't even know what it's called. So anyway, I'm also on Instagram. I occasionally post reels that have Victorian flavor. And I'm on Pinterest. You can find all my inspiration for my gaslamp fantasies and a lot of my research too, if you're interested in that. So you can find me in most places, and my books are going to be on my website. The Gaslamp Fantasy is only on Kindle Vella right now. It will be published in paperback and ebook eventually. I'm hoping for this year. And the Historical Suspense is on Amazon and, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, all the usual places.
Okay, Courtney, where can we find you?
You can find me on my website, CourtneyMillicum.com. I'm also very active on Instagram And on my website, you can also sign up for my monthly newsletter. And all my books are available on Amazon, ebook, paperback, and hardback. And the ebook is also in Kindle Unlimited.
Okay, Margaret, where can we find you?
You can find me on YouTube almost every day. I post twice a week for sure, sometimes more, doing booktube and authortube stuff. You can find my books on Books to Read through like any retailer under the sun. That is bit.ly/shop_Margaret. So all the books, all the retailers, they should be available there. I am also on Twitter, and I've tried to streamline the social media, but I still save my like, this is a brilliant thought, I'm going to put it out in the universe for Twitter, which is really throwing pearls before swine. But what are you going to do? So yeah, I would love to see anybody there too.
Okay, Olivia, where can we find you?
I technically have a bunch of social media accounts, which I barely use. So the best place to really interact with me is, you can find my stuff on oliviaatwater.com. You can sign up for my newsletter there, which is mostly where I interact with people. And I have a Patreon with Discord access, and I chat a lot with readers and sometimes other authors there. So that's where I am mostly active, though word to the wise, do not join the Discord unless you want to hear about Andor. A lot of Andor. I love Andor. Me and my husband both loved the series, and we have lots of writing stuff to say about it. So we have gone on rants sometimes about, oh my God, did you see how they pulled this off?
Right.
Okay, and I can recommend Olivia's newsletter. It's very good. So,
Thank you.
and you can find me at afstewart.ca. I've got all my social medias, all my books, everything there, and it's easy to find. I also have a Facebook group, AF Stewart's Minions, which is a fun place to hang out. And that's me. And and I do have a book coming up in October that I want to give a quick plug to because it's a historical fantasy, fairy tales, and nightmares. So there we go. And
can I add, actually, I completely forgot. I've been talking about my Victorian fairy tale. There are preview chapters on my Patreon and newsletter for people who want to read them. Sorry, continue.
Okay, I was just going to say I want to thank everyone for being our guest today because it was a pleasure chatting with everybody. It was a fun time, and that's it for now. So bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.